How do everybody? So I'm doing a follow-on video from yesterday's story where I basically read the court report, the sentencing orders from 2013's Oxford case. Now there is a man by the names of Charlie Peters who works for GB News. He's basically his entire career has been based around covering these sorts of stories, and I found a really interesting thread that he's done on Twitter, X, whichever one you want to call it. I am going to read it out verbatim. Please, if you're on X, do go over and please do follow him and send the man some love. The guy is genuinely doing God's work, and in the off chance that Charlie does happen to catch wind of this video, or anybody from GB News does, this video is not intended to be any sort of plagiarism. It is purely intended for the wider benefit of the victims and to try and get his important information out to as many people as I can. And if I can get just 5 more people to be aware of the fantastic work that Charlie is doing by sharing his work on my micro channel on YouTube, then I do feel that I have helped contribute towards his work in helping him in his goals and the amount of impact that he's having on this very important topic. And please do contact me if you do happen to see this, and I will be more than happy to make any adjustments, arrangements, or possibly even delete the video if you really are that unhappy about it. It is not intended to cause any sort of upset, friction, or anything like that between my channel, myself, and yourselves. So anyway, we'll get on with the reading now. Oh, and I will put a link towards Charlie's X channel and this particular thread as well below. So once again, please, if you're watching this and you are on X, Twitter, please do go and share with him, and please do like and subscribe to him. We'll get on with the reading now. Britain's grooming gang scandal is attracting attention. It's happened before, but now it seems different. I've dedicated most of my career in journalism to covering it because it's the most appalling atrocity in modern British history. In this thread, I'll tell you what I know about the crisis, what I've uncovered, and what is yet to be revealed. When did it start? Reports of gangs of men abusing children via on-street grooming go back as far as the 1970s, but it first came to major prominence after Labour MP Anne Cryer raised concerns about the targeting of young girls by Asian men outside school gates. It was 2003. She was accused of racism by many in her own party and had to instill a panic alarm. Cryer was vilified for trying to support girls facing appalling abuse by predominantly Pakistani men. She was first to endure this treatment, but by no means the last. Then, a year later, in 2004, came Edge of the City, a Channel 4 documentary about social workers in Bradford. Hours before transmission, it was yanked from the schedules. Unite Against Fascism, the 1990 Trust, and the National Assembly Against Racism lobbied Channel 4 to drop it, as did the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire. The local elections were coming up, and the film captured grooming gangs for the first time. South Asian men abusing teenage white girls. They were worried that the BNP, that is the British National Party, who were making a lot of noise about the abuse gangs, would profit. So it was canned. Another opportunity to discuss children as young as 11 being gang raped was missed. And this is something, guys, that I keep talking about, how this whole topic of young children being raped is being covered up for people's political and professional gain, because these people are more interested in lining their own pockets, profiteering from other people's suffering, than they are about actually dealing with our problems. These people from underclass parts of society are sacrificial lambs that they are happy to burn on the pyre of diversity. A journalist based in the north was next to pick up the story. Andrew Norfolk at the Times had reported on Anne Cryer, but he moved on because he admitted, "I didn't want the story to be true because it made me deeply uncomfortable." And there's another point, guys. This is also what I keep talking about: cowardice. A lot of these people are absolute cowards. Rather than facing up to the truth, they'd rather just bury their head in the sand like an ostrich and pretend that the whole world works like they want it to work. Absolute cowards. Dangerous people. Remember, it's more important to deal with traitors than it is to deal with the enemy. Always remember that, people. The suggestion that men from a minority ethnic background were committing sex crimes against white children was always going to be the far right's fantasy story come true. Well, it's only a fantasy story, I'm afraid, because people like this are burying their heads in the sand and not dealing with it. And unfortunately, they've now created this mountain, which once upon a time could have just been a molehill and could have been dealt with very swiftly and very efficiently. Liberal angst kicked instinctively into top gear, but in 2010, something snapped in Norfolk, and he felt like he could do that, like he could no longer ignore it. Well, fair play to him, and I do remember that story breaking, by the way, guys. Fair play to him for changing his mind eventually. He's still a coward for his earlier work, and he's going to have to carry that with him to the grave. But my goodness, at least he changed his mind at a later point, and that must be celebrated as well. It really, really must. It must. And men like him should come forward as well, and they need to speak about the guilt that he feels and to tell other people about how dreadful and taxing it is on him and the damage he's caused to himself and his family and to wider society. Because a lot of harm to a lot of children could have been avoided if that man had spoken up sooner. In 2010, he heard a radio report about a grooming gang in Manchester. He started going through archives. What he found was a pattern. Since 1997, there had been... Oh, that was when Tony Blair got into power as well, by the way. There had been 17 cases in 13 towns where a group of men had approached a girl on the street and groomed her. Of the 56 convictions, 3 were white, 53 were Asian. 50 of those had Muslim names, most were Pakistani. But when he went to the authorities, they refused to talk. Bernardo's, the children's charity, told staff not to talk to him. At the time, it seemed like the only prominent people talking about the crisis were right-wing politicians and activists such as Tommy Robinson's EDL. That is the man whose real name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon and is currently residing at His Majesty's leisure. And once again, people, as I've told you about before, the entire institutional structure, from charities to the police to social services, all of them are corrupted by this entire policy of DEI and multiculturalism, and they are willing to sacrifice as many young children's bodies on the funeral pyre of diversity, equality and inclusion. They genuinely care more about their ideology than people's lives. The strategy of the groomers was to pose as a friend or a boyfriend. That's why we call them grooming gangs. Personally, I prefer to call them rape gangs, but grooming is an accurate term of part of the process. But the grooming is not the actual thing that they're doing. It is the rape at the end of it. The grooming is a means to an end. So that is where I disagree with the term grooming gangs. I actually personally believe that the term grooming gang has been used by the courts and by the legal industry to try and diminish the actual severity of these crimes in a sort of form of psychological operation against the mass public. Because if they did refer to them as rape gangs in the main media and in news reports and in court documents, there would be far more of a public outcry against them. I definitely believe that grooming is an intentional word to try and obfuscate and try and muddy the waters of the reality of the severity of the crimes. Then drew the girl into their social circle with gifts and attention. They'd offer them drugs and alcohol, and then they'd abuse them. Threats were used against them or their family to control them, and then they'd be passed around the whole gang to abuse. What blew this open was the small town of Rotherham, with its decaying steelworks and beautiful medieval chapel. Then Andrew Norfolk met Jane Senior. She ran Risky Business, a youth project working with children at risk of exploitation. More and more of her work had come to involve abused girls. She was able to introduce Norfolk to victims and their families, but neither the journalist or the whistleblower expected the scale of the scandal that would emerge. And with the scale of the scandal, by the way, to these people from outside of these sort of northern towns, one of which I'm from, by the way, that has been affected by this, it is absolutely surprising to them. But people from my part of the world, we've been talking about this for decades, and we are absolutely not surprised by the scale of it. And it's something that we've been harping on about for decades and have been called all sorts of horrible things, from racist to xenophobic to hateful to Nazis to everything else. It is just so apparently clear to people who live in this part of England that how much of a scale of it there actually is. And even now, with how much of it's been spoken about, it is still only the tip of the iceberg. It says Sarah Champion, MP for Rotherham, Labour MP, estimated up to 1 million girls could have been affected by this. You know, we're in a country of about 70 million people. That's not small potatoes. That's a serious amount of people that we're talking about. Somewhere in the region, when you're talking about the white British population, you're probably talking somewhere between about 7 and 10% of the entire demographic. of white British women. It's an insane number, an absolutely insanely high number, and absolutely unforgivable. It's tantamount to treason what these people have done. Reports of the abuse in the town went back decades. The victims who spoke to Norfolk revealed how they'd been horribly abused, the most horrific torture and sexual depravity. And they also spoke of how the authorities, Rotherham Council and South Yorkshire Police, had failed them. They hadn't failed them, they'd intentionally destroyed their reputations and went out of their way to arrest them. Failing them would have been a failure to act. No. The council and the police went far beyond failure. They actually went out of their way to antagonise them and to trip them up and to cover up the crimes. Failure, I'm afraid, undersells just how serious it is what's been done to these young women. The stories caused an outcry. The government stepped in and commissioned social worker Alexis J to hold an inquiry. She found that this wasn't about a few girls. She established that between 1997 and 2013, 1,400 children had been abused. That was a conservative estimate. That was only in Rotherham as well, by the way, people, not across the whole country. That was in one small town in the northwest of England. Almost all the victims were white. Most of the abusers were Pakistani. And that's despite them only making up just 5% of the town. The report was so damning that Rotherham Council was investigated in 2015. Louise Casey found that the authorities had failed the victims and that the council had covered up the abuse. Political correctness was to blame, but also was something sinister. Pakistani British councillors were wielding unusual power and they had used it to head off concerns. People who tried to raise concerns were silenced with bogus accusations of racism. But even though some people left their jobs, nobody was fired. The guilty all kept their pensions, some got jobs with other councils, some who knew but looked the other way were finally deselected by Labour in 2023 after a series of GB News reports, so just over a year ago, people. And nobody has been sent to prison, nobody has been fined, nobody has had the police knocking on their doors, or really more seriously, military intelligence should be knocking on their doors. You know, it's absolutely crazy. You know, this is comparable to the mafia operating in Chicago in the sort of 1920s and 1930s. The level of corruption that's happening is unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. And what astounds me even further is the government's unwillingness to deal with this. I mean, it was only yesterday, I believe, that Jess Phillips, who's supposedly the champion of women's rights in the British government, has decided not to do a government-backed investigation into Rotherham and into Oldham and into these councils. They are refusing to engage in it and blocking any official government investigations into it. There were serious questions about how the crisis had been allowed to go on for so long. One instance had always stuck with me. In March 2000, a secret deal was cut. It was arranged between a child rapist and police officers. An abused girl was handed over to the police by her abuser. In return, he was allowed to go free. It's absolutely crazy, isn't it? Jahangir Akhtar, who later became deputy head of the council, was accused of facilitating the deal. He denied it. The abuser was his cousin, Arshid Hussain, a notorious gangster. Foreign systems of prioritising distant family kinship over justice causing a crisis. In South Yorkshire, Hassan Ali, the policeman who helped arrange the secret deal, was run over and killed by a car on the day he was told he was under investigation. Well, what a weird coincidence that is, isn't it? How strange is that? With his death, there was no further inquiry. Well, isn't that convenient? It's almost like that was a hit done by the government on him. Now, obviously, I'm just saying that speculatively, and I have no evidence to prove that, but that really does seem like somebody from the council or the government has done that to him. It's to block a further investigation. That's almost like the mafia in 1920 Chicago, in fact, isn't it? That's something you'd expect Al Capone to have done, isn't it? Let's be honest. That is like something from that period, from the Prohibition history of America, isn't it? There was also a Home Office report. In 2000, a local solicitor worked with Risky Business. She discovered the scale of the abuse and how much of it revolved around the gangster Arshid Hussain and his brothers. But when she filed her report, she was told it was unhelpful. And when a victim she worked with went to the police, she was texted by her abuser. He had her sibling. She dropped the complaint. You actually can't make this up. Kidnapping and holding family members hostage. That is actually mafia-style tactics, isn't it? But who at the police station had told her abuser she was there? Well, well, well. Let's find out, shall we? And by the way, I haven't read this before, but I've got a feeling it may be a cousin of that person. I've got a feeling. Let's see if I'm wrong. When the solicitor complained, she was never told to refer to Asian men ever again. She was also booked on a 2-day equality and diversity course. There we go, people. Look, these sycophants are far more interested in pushing politics than they are in protecting young children. Equality and diversity is the sacred cow that must be protected at all costs. And anything that comes into question it or makes it look bad must be destroyed with extreme prejudice. You read that right. Raise concerns about minority rapists targeting girls and you'll be sent for ideological retraining. This is literally Soviet Union style tactics being used against the British people here. And then the risky business offices were broken into. Offices. There was no sign the doors had been forced, no sign the filing cabinets were broken into, but the files were missing. That's almost like the police have gone in there, isn't it? That's almost like people who are trained in actually entering properties and know how to go about finding things of importance and know how to look through files and what to actually identify and specialise in it, have gone in there and found this information. Again, I've no evidence to prove that myself, but that's what that leads me to believe, that is actually police officers doing that. And her password-protected computer had been accessed. Documents had been deleted. Can you imagine that? That's not a regular gangster, is it, doing that? That's people with access to incredibly specialised digital tools. Now, who in the country would have access to such digital tools as that? Maybe law enforcement? Maybe the secret services? Who knows? The minutes of meetings which hadn't occurred had been created. That you can't make up, can you? Falsifying meetings that never even happened. Who was behind the break-in? Nobody has ever been arrested for it. It has never been explained. This is the crimes that are being committed against the British people. Just be aware of that, everybody. But the true horror of the grooming gang scandal is that Rotherham wasn't the only town. There was also Rochdale. A gang of Asian men had abused... Oh, sorry about that, guys. I pressed something by accident on the screen there. Let's carry on with it. The true horror of the grooming gang scandal is that Rotherham wasn't the only town. There was also Rochdale. A gang of Asian men had abused girls. They took them to a special place and plied them with alcohol. Then they were passed around from man to man like a ball. There was a list of names on the door of the building where the girls were kept. Whenever an abuser went there, they put a tick by their name so they could pay for their rapes at the end of each month. An honesty box for rape. My goodness. Oh, in fact, he says that in the next line. It was like a paedophile honesty box. How crazy is that? That's like getting a tab behind a bar and paying it off. Like this is such a level of close-knit community behaviour, because you don't do that with strangers. That's with people you know and trust are going to pay at the end of the month. This is an entire community-wide problem, people. This isn't just a small group of isolated individuals, I'm afraid. The failures in Rochdale were so severe that it took the bravery of whistleblower Maggie Oliver to expose the scandal in the town. Maggie Oliver is an absolute saint of a woman, and she should have been knighted and not Sadiq Khan. But she won't be, because she's exposed the failures of the government. And then there was Telford. The Labour Council there tried to block an inquiry. 10 men wrote a letter to the Home Secretary saying it wasn't necessary. Some claimed reports of abuse uncovered by investigative journalists had been sensationalised, even after what had been revealed in Rotherham and Rochdale. But when the Crowther report was written, it found there was at least 1,000 victims. Most of the victims were white, most of the abusers Pakistani. Only 4.7% of the town was Asian. The same pattern, the same racial targeting kept coming up time after time, again and again. Rotherham, Rochdale and Telford are just a handful of the towns and cities that have endured these abuse gangs. I've compiled compelling reports and successful prosecutions from across Britain, from Bristol and Oxford right up to Glasgow. The horrors in each of these towns deserves their own report, their own reckoning, their own righteous response. and many of the girls were trafficked between towns by their abusers. When parents tried to intervene, they were often threatened with arrest. That's something I've often spoken about as well, guys, how often the police have come down on those reporting these crimes, either by threatening them with arrest or actually arresting them. I've met parents who were so desperate for support from the police, but instead found themselves being penalised when they raised concerns about their children, their little girls, being targeted by rape gangs. The grooming gang story is a stake through the heart of multicultural Britain. I would call it colonised Britain myself, because that is the behaviour of colonisers, in my personal opinion. There's nothing multicultural about it. This is in my view, the behaviour of conquerors, like a marauding horde of military conquerors, like you would expect to read in military history, going back to the Middle Ages. For decades, gangs of largely British Pakistani men deliberately targeted and abused underage white girls, and the authorities did nothing because they did not want to rock the boat of racial tensions. They literally prioritised community cohesion over the safety and security of women and girls. And also, people, this is also the behaviour of, as I say, colonisation. When you look at the history of colonised countries, the colonisers often do get preferential treatment by the ruling elites in various countries, whether those ruling elites be colonisers themselves or wealthy natives of those lands who are benefiting massively from the presence of the colonisers, you know, and are willing to betray their own people in order to enrich themselves. This is something that has been shown multiple times through history, and it's also on the warning signs of genocide. The 10 steps to genocide is when the authorities start clamping down on specific groups of people. I think it's step 4. We might look at that actually at the end of this video. In many cases, the abuse went beyond rape into sadism. Reading the testimony, attending the trial, speaking to survivors, sometimes it is truly harrowing. Don't read on if you find this too difficult. Gang rape, anal pumps, beatings, girls being marked with the initials on their abusers, broken bottles being shoved into them, girls being doused with petrol, stabbings, thrashings, fake executions, real executions, pure total depravity. Let us not also forget that girls were also got addicted to drugs, and one girl was even turned into kebab meat as well in Blackpool. Charlie Downs, I think her name was. Often the girls were called white whores and white slags. Yeah, and with that, as I said in the video yesterday, I've said multiple times before, none of these people ever get charged with racially aggravated crimes, which I know it would make no difference on the sentencing whatsoever, but it's just the fact that even in court, the courts refuse to acknowledge the racial aspect of these crimes. I'm convinced that it is the greatest race hate crime in modern Britain. There is no comparison, but the authorities don't want to see it that way. And the people who set our national conversations don't want to see it that way, but it's what the evidence shows. The state has gone to great lengths to avoid admitting this. After years of pressure, the Home Office was forced to commission a report into grooming gangs. At first, the civil servants tried to spike it, and when that failed, they botched it. Rather than use their own trove of data, they relied on a handful of weak studies. All they wanted was the headline, whites were the most common type of abuser. Now they could claim there was no racial issue. But white made up at least 85% of the population over this period, and the report found they still made up at less than 30% of abusers. Asians, especially British Pakistanis, were overrepresented. It was a fix, a stitch-up, a distraction. It's what I often say is called obfuscation, people. That is exactly what it is. It's where they try to muddy the waters to confuse casual readers so they have plausible deniability, and it's disgusting. It's lying by omission. More recently, a study found that Pakistanis dominate national grooming gang statistics. By comparing the number of prosecutions to the overall population, it showed that 1 in every 2,200 Muslim men over 16 in England and Wales have been prosecuted for this crime in 1997 to 2017. When it came to Pakistanis, it was 1 in 1,700. In Rochdale, 1 in 280 Muslim males over 16 were prosecuted. That's crazy numbers. In Telford, it was 1 in 126. In Rotherham, it was 1 in 73. My goodness. That is crazy numbers. That is impossible for people to have not have known these in those communities. They highlight it there, 1 in 73. Absolutely impossible for that to not be known by the wider community, including people who weren't within the Asian community. The same dark forces that want you to not notice this moved fiercely against Andrew Norfolk. He was accused of being a racist and an Islamophobe. An unholy alliance of the far left and Islamic groups hounded him. It was simple. They would repeat the lie over and over. They would hound anyone who disagreed. They did the same to Sarah Champion, the Labour Rotherham MP, who was attacked by the left when she spoke out against the appalling crisis. Jack Straw was also accused of racism for referring to Andrew Norfolk's report. For a while, I'm sorry, people, that's also something else that I tell you about as well. This is I talk about incentives that people are working by. None of this covering up the crimes is written down in legislation anywhere. But there are strong incentive processes because of these sorts of vociferous attacks on highly prominent people who they try to destroy to set an example to other people to shut them out. This is how they do it. This is how they bring about silence and compliance. They don't have to have streams of paper handed out as in pieces of instructions to the police and to other MPs and things like that. All they do is destroy the careers of a couple of key people like Sarah Champion and they attempted to do to Jack Straw. And everybody else looks at that and goes, I don't want my life ruining like those people have just had their lives ruining. I'll just keep my mouth shut because that's better for me, because there's no consequences for me and my family if I keep my mouth shut. Well, at least not in the short term anyway. Unfortunately, they're not thinking what will happen in 20, 30, 40 years' time, are they? They're idiots and cowards, these people. Absolute traitors, in my opinion. For a while, this campaign of abuse to keep people quiet worked. The cases kept coming, but there was no campaign, nobody to join the dots. Tommy Robinson was essentially the lone voice, but he was also ignored by the establishment due to widespread controversy. It wasn't controversy, it was just class hatred, that's all it was. It's because he was a working class man with a working class accent who expressed himself using working class terminology, and the middle class find that a complete anathema to their sensibilities and how they view the world, and they see it as lowering their own social status if they support him, because that's all they're interested in, is how the rest of the middle class and upper class view him. Nobody had any success trying to bring this issue into the mainstream. In the winter of 2021, I started a project. The grooming gang scandal had always horrified me, but the trail seemed to have gone cold, and nobody had really brought all the journalism together. So with my friend, Dampier Guy, we put together a few £100, took some time off work and went to Rotherham to start filming. We had some immense footage, exclusive interviews and a big vision. Even if we were a couple of amateurs, our project was turned down by almost everyone. Even the right-wing media didn't want to work with me, let alone big broadcasters. Well, you know what? I fully understand what he's saying there, because they're going a bit off topic here, but the amount of media companies I've tried to contact about the absolute gross treatment that I've received by child maintenance and by the family legal system is unbelievable. None of them are interested in it. So I really, really do understand that, because unfortunately a lot of these people have the attitude of, well, it's not affecting me and my family, so I don't care. That's your problem. And they go along with the stigmatised ideology. In myself, they'll view me as a deadbeat dad. And like with those little girls, they'll view them as white slags. And that is just the mentality that a lot of these people in these parts of society have, unfortunately. They're not interested. But until it starts happening to them and their families, that is, anyway. But GB News saw promise. Colin Brazier put me on his programme to discuss my project, and soon after the channel commissioned me to make a documentary. It was time to reveal Britain's shame. And by the way, I've tried to contact GB News about issues as well revolving around the family courts and child maintenance and things like that. Nothing back off them. Apart from, no, we're not covering that story at this time, sorry bud. That's all I got from him. The year-long investigation shook me to my core, not just at the scale of the abuse or the way it had been covered up, but at the fact it was still going on. After all these years, what the victims were telling me was that the abuse hadn't ended. In some cases, it was actually getting worse, and in many cases, the rapist had been freed from jail after a few years. Yeah, well, that's something that I didn't want to get onto yesterday, but we were reading about that 2013 case where guys were expected, although they were getting, say, a 40-year sentence, they were expected to spend at least 20 years in prison. They won't. The way that the legal system works is some of them could be out after 7, 8, 10 years, I'm afraid. So that's a lot. Although the sentence in itself sounds incredibly rigid and the judge sounds incredibly confident in what he's saying, once they're in prison, you then have a different system in charge of them. And those sorts of rules can be overturned. There are ways and means around it, I'm afraid. So, yeah, he's absolutely correct here when he's saying that these people are getting out after only a few years, even though they've had very heavy sentences put upon them. Imagine that. Seeing your rapist walking the same streets as you. Well, that happened to one of the girls in Rotherham. She bumped into her rapist in Asda, a man who'd done horrific things to her and forced her to have an abortion as well. And some of them were organised. In some places, I was followed. The streets were hostile. I'll never forget my first days of investigating and filming parts of Telford, Rochdale and Glodwick near Oldham. It was a genuinely hostile environment. My small team stood out wherever we went. We were not welcome. We were often speeding out of some places after quickly filming what we needed. Our questions and our presence was not welcome. Yeah, but they start milling around, don't they? You end up with gangs of them surrounding you, and they're always constantly moving to try and keep you confused. And it's like if one of them hits you, you don't know who's done it because the crowd's always shifting and moving around you. There's a word for it. Oh, I can't remember. There's an Arabic word for it. I'll try and find out what that is. I don't know if I'll have it for the end of this video or not, though. When we finally broadcast Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame, I was relieved. It was a big project, and soon after, the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, announced a new task force to tackle the grooming gangs. Our key policy demanded in the documentary. It made hundreds of arrests in its first year, but the battle wasn't over yet. I knew there was far more victims out there whose tales needed to be told. I knew there were far too many rapists released on our streets. Well, the thing is if we hung them, they wouldn't be able to be released on the streets, would they? That would solve a lot of these problems if we started hanging these people, along with the traitors who covered up these crimes as well. Some people might say that's harsh or goes too far. I think it's just common sense myself, and I think we do need to start exploring that avenue of solution. And I knew the far left and the Islamists would come for me, of course. They have mostly just accused me of being a racist, the same accusation they deployed on everyone else who raised concerns. But this attack line just doesn't work anymore. Anyone who wants to call me a racist in response to my reporting can pick a number, get in line and kiss my arse. I don't care. That is brilliant. That is attitude. And unfortunately, the term racist has been so overly used now that when there are real racists, nobody's going to listen anymore. It's the boy who cried wolf syndrome. People have got to the point of it being apathy. That if not wanting little girls to be raped makes you a rapist, then people are going to start wearing the badge of rapist with pride. That's just the reality of it. It's like, yeah, I'm a rapist. I'm a racist because I don't want to see little girls getting raped. You know, that's going to be it. It's that simple, really, guys. It's that simple. I've done my homework. Your slander means nothing. Since the film was released, I've continued to champion the cause of the survivors for this nationwide scandal. There has been bold reporting from some other outlets, but prominent voices and commentators in the mainstream continue to neglect the truth of the crisis. Perhaps they fear the same abusive treatment that Andrew Norfolk championed and others endured, but it's left me with a lot of stories to cover. For GB News, I've exposed councillors who knew about the abuse and did nothing. My reporting has seen a parliamentary candidate be deselected. We've shown that a former councillor who silenced discussions of Pakistani rape gangs later went on to work in diversity and inclusion in the NHS. Yeah, guys, that's a real thing that happened, and it's crazy. Absolutely crazy, these sorts of things that have happened. And I've revealed several further policing failures in historic and recent cases. And by the way, the NHS would have known that he'd done that because they can do DBS checks. So they will have been able to find that information out, but they chose to overlook it for diversity and equity reasons. Now, I can't prove that. That's just my own speculation. I must be very clear on that. But that is my honest held belief. I know there are still guilty men in the police and the councils who still need to face justice. For example, for police officers in Rotherham, there were 265 allegations of misconduct with 91 investigations involving 47 officers. Of those, only 5 suffered any penalties. Nobody was fired. Well, that's news to me, by the way. Some of them were senior officers. Many have retired. Well, they should be strung up. That's my opinion. Legally and lawfully. No mobs. But there should be trials held. And we should try them for treason and hang them if found guilty. That is now my mission. To ensure that nobody involved in the mass rape and cover-up is able to get away with it. Get involved. Get in touch. Get ready. And there's my message at the bottom. They need hanging for treason. 14 hours ago. Right, guys. I'm going to stop the recording there. I'm going to see about finding that 10 Steps to Genocide in a moment. We'll see about getting that open, then we'll just have a quick look at it, and then I'll see if I can find that phrase as well for the milling around. I'll speak to you very, very shortly. Okay, guys, so I found this handy graphic using Google. 10 stages of genocide. So we've got stage 1, classification. People are divided into us and them. That is exactly what's been done under the law, by the way, with things like the Equality Act and the Race Relations Act and things like that. We have very, very clear defined laws around people who are from privileged groups and people who are supposedly from underprivileged groups. You have people who are classed as asylum seekers and you have people who are classed as regular citizens. And there definitely is an us and them. And we often see this, that the outer groups, the people of like people who say are refugees, people from minority groups, are defined as being the prioritised group who do get preferential treatment. This is seen in all things, and it also goes things like men and women as well, like in the family court system where men are treated worse than women. People might not like me saying that, but that is the reality of it. Our entire system is like that. Very, very divided system. Symbolisation, people are forced to identify themselves. Well, again, people might say, you know, you think back to the Holocaust, people having to wear like a Star of David on their chest. People might say, well, we're not having to do that. It's like, no, we're not. But on all your government documentation, you have to have it white British. You have to absolutely have who you are identified. Whenever you apply for a job applications are always asking for you to identify who you are. This is something that is done in quite a subtle way, but it really does happen. Yes, it's not being done out and proud and having to wear a sign on your chest saying I'm a heterosexual white male as an example, but it does happen, and we've seen that with things like with the Royal Air Force in their hiring practices, where they've officially stated in their meetings that they don't want useless white male pilots. That is a direct quote from what the RAF heads have said. So yes, that is a real thing that we have been experiencing. Discrimination. People begin to face systemic discrimination. Well, as I've just said, things like the RAF are saying that they don't want useless white males. We've seen this in the police where white males have been rejected from that. We're seeing it in hiring practices in various government departments and in the BBC where they are doing adverts directed at people who are not white. And they are actually discriminating actively against hiring white people. We're also seeing it in the way that actors are being pushed out of things like advertising industry, out of film and acting industry, all these other things. You can even hear it with voice actors on the radio. You can tell by the accents of some people. I'm not saying by the tone of the voice, it's by their actual accent that you know that they are from a place that isn't Britain. And that is from somewhere like, say, Africa or the Bahamas or somewhere like that. This is actively being done against us. Dehumanisation, people equated with animals, vermin or diseases. This is something that we are seeing a lot of on the on people communicating in online platforms, where white people are often being referred to as vermin. I'm actually seeing it. One picture I saw yesterday was an individual in, I think it was either Paddington or Victoria Station in London, where they said, seeing all the rats scuttling away to the Cotswolds makes me happy, or words to the effect of. This is something that is happening, again, on a regular basis in day-to-day conversations with people who are not indigenous to these islands. It is and again, in all of the cases involving the Pakistani, Bangladeshi Muslim rape gangs, where they are often referring to the girls as pigs, white pigs. That is a thing that often happens. Organisation, government recreates special groups, police, military, to enforce the policies. Well, they haven't had to create a special group because the police already exist, but the police are absolutely acting in that manner. This is undeniable. That is what the police are organised, and the social services and local councils are absolutely organised in destroying these communities of indigenous people. That is undeniable at this point, I'm afraid, and not a single thing anybody can say to me will change my mind on that. Polarisation. The government broadcasts propaganda to turn the populace against the group. Well, isn't that funny? Because we have actually seen that in multiple TV shows where, for example, ITV on Coronation Street have done multiple stories involving radicalised gangs and children being groomed. But guess what? The perpetrators are always white. It's the same with multiple adverts for things. There was one where they were advertising for something to do with prisons. They originally taken pictures where it was a genuine photograph of a white prison guard with a black prisoner, and they got told to change it. So they had to have a black prison guard with a white prisoner. And we see this all the time in the news, where newspapers will be showing pictures of criminals where they're using stock pictures, and the stock picture is always a white male, even when it is known that the perpetrator will have been, say, an Islamist terrorist attack, as an example. This is always happening, constantly happening, and everybody sees this all the time, where we're even seeing things like Anne Boleyn being turned into a black person on a Channel 5 TV show. This is again. This is something that is happening. The government has actually just unveiled that they are going to start pushing diversity propaganda across all sections of society, including in education. They are putting diversity into overdrive. This is genuinely parts of the stages of genocide. Preparation, official action to remove, relocate people begins. Well, guess what? Scatter. I suggest you look it up. They are moving these boat people and migrants around the country and into brand new houses at the expense of the indigenous population. We are literally being pushed out of our own towns and villages and cities. You go to many places across England and you will go into many cities that only 50 years ago were almost entirely white English, and now some of them are minority English. That is not happened by accident, I'm afraid. That is intentional. Yes, they may not have been sending soldiers and police in forcibly removing people, but what they have done is done preferential treatment for those who are from outside of Britain to be able to move into there and help them to do it. Beginning of murders, theft or property, trial massacres. Well, we've already been seeing that with the grooming gangs and the cover-up, haven't we? Where children and parents and people like that are being getting murdered. And this has been happening across the whole of England. We have been seeing theft increasing in our country and of property. People's homes are getting burgled and people are getting extorted by these sorts of gangs. It is happening. We are also seeing on our streets all of these shops opening up which are engaged in various forms of organised crime, and those shops are a front for laundering that money from those crimes. That's where I think we're at, number 8. Now, do I think we're deep into number 8? No, I don't. But I certainly think we are starting to touch into it. That is the stage that we're getting into. And I mean that seriously, people. If you do disagree with me on that, please, by all means, do let me know. I would be very, very interested to know what you think on that. But that is, I'm incredibly, incredibly worried about what is happening in this country. And I do take this stuff very, very seriously. Now, see if I can find that term for the milling about. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find that term. I will keep looking for it, and I'll try and raise it in a future video. It does, unfortunately, it does elude me. I've tried various ways of searching for it, but it's effectively to do with large groups of men milling around a person to target and harass them. I can't remember if it's an Arabic, Egyptian, or an Indian word either. So again, that does disturb, but I think it's a great descriptor, and I will try and find that for future reference. Anyway, I hope you found that video interesting, insightful, or anything like that. Like I said, please do go to Charlie's X page. Please do follow him, and please do send him some love, because that man is doing excellent, excellent work. Anyway, thanks for your time. Take care and goodbye.